This is not merely a story about railways or ports. It is a story about control over trade, over sovereignty, and over the future direction of North American economic power. For more than a century, Canada's exports moved through American systems by default, not by choice. Rail lines, ports, and logistics networks south of the border quietly dictated costs, schedules, and leverage. Now, with a $262 million investment into the long-forgotten Hudson Bay Railway, Canada is attempting something bold, reclaiming autonomy over its own trade routes. The move has profound consequences, strategic, economic, and geopolitical, that reach far beyond steel and tracks. Canada's strategic break from dependency. For generations, Canada's trade geography followed a narrow and deeply entrenched logic. Grain from the prairies, minerals from the Shield, and energy from the West all moved south before moving outward. American railways carried them. American ports processed them. American companies decided what moved first, what waited, and at what cost. This arrangement was rarely framed as coercion. It was simply how things worked. The infrastructure existed, the routes were reliable, and alternatives, particularly Canada's own northern corridors, were seen as impractical, unreliable, or economically risky. But dependence has a cost, and over time that cost became impossible to ignore. Canadian exporters paid higher transit fees. Supply chains became vulnerable to U.S. labor disputes, congestion, and political pressure. Even shipments bound for Europe were routinely routed through American ports, handing strategic leverage to a foreign system. What appeared efficient on paper increasingly looked like a structural weakness in practice. The Hudson Bay Railway was once supposed to be the solution. Conceived in the early 20th century, it promised a direct northern route from the prairies to the port of Churchill, shaving distance to European markets and bypassing U.S. intermediaries altogether. On maps, it made sense. On balance sheets, it struggled. The line crossed some of the most hostile terrain on the continent. Permafrost that shifted seasonally, muskeg that swallowed track beds, and weather that punished steel and labor alike. Maintenance costs spiraled. Reliability suffered. The port at Churchill, constrained by ice and limited capacity, could only operate for a narrow window each year. By the late 20th century, political patience ran out. Ottawa no longer saw the railway as a national asset, but as a liability. In a move that symbolized just how far confidence had collapsed, the railway and port were sold in the 1990s to an American firm for a single dollar. Investment dwindled, deferred maintenance became the norm, and in 2017, a major flood severed the line entirely, cutting off the town of Churchill from surface transportation for more than a year. Yet history has a way of resurfacing when circumstances change. Rising geopolitical tension, supply chain disruptions, and renewed pressure from Washington, especially during Donald Trump's presidency, forced a reassessment. When Mark Carney rose to leadership with a mandate to push back against external pressure, the Hudson Bay Railway was no longer viewed as a failed experiment. It was seen as leverage. The $262 million joint federal and provincial investment announced in 2025 marked a decisive break from the past. This was not routine maintenance or symbolic support. It was a full-scale reconstruction designed to elevate the railway to Class 1 standards, the highest tier of freight rail in North America. Heavy loads, high reliability, predictable performance, the kind of infrastructure serious exporters require before committing billions in long-term contracts. Modern engineering addressed problems that once seemed unsolvable. Stabilized roadbeds designed specifically for permafrost. Heavy-duty rails and ties capable of supporting unit trains. Rebuilt bridges and culverts to withstand extreme weather. Advanced monitoring systems. Ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR mapping, drones, embedded sensors, and AI-driven predictive maintenance shifted operations from reactive crisis management to planned intervention. For the first time in decades, the railway operated not as a gamble, but as a dependable corridor. This transformation carried meaning far beyond transportation. It signaled permanence. It told global markets that Canada was serious about controlling its own export routes. It reassured producers that the corridor would not disappear midway through a contract, and it reframed the Arctic not as a barrier, but as a gateway. For Canada, the implications are profound. A functioning northern trade route reduces exposure to U.S. bottlenecks, tariffs, and political volatility. It strengthens negotiating power in future trade disputes. It diversifies access to European markets at a moment when supply chain resilience matters as much as cost. And it reasserts a principle long overshadowed by convenience, that a sovereign nation should not be structurally dependent on another country to reach the world. Yet this strategic gain does not exist in isolation. Every gain for one actor creates ripple effects for others, some positive, some destabilizing. Industries, communities, and even allied economies are now forced to adjust to a shifting map of North American trade. And as Canada redraws its routes, the consequences will not stop at its borders. The shockwave through U.S. ports and logistics power. For decades, American ports and rail operators benefited quietly, but enormously from Canada's lack of alternatives. Grain from Saskatchewan, potash from Manitoba, minerals from the north, and even energy-related equipment flowed south as a matter of routine. Fees were collected, storage contracts were signed, scheduling authority rested largely in U.S. hands. This was not framed as dominance, it was framed as integration. But integration, when one side controls the choke points, becomes leverage, whether it is acknowledged or not. The Hudson Bay Railway upgrade threatens to disrupt that equilibrium. Every ton of cargo that moves north to Churchill instead of south to U.S. ports represents revenue that disappears from American balance sheets. Rail carriers lose haulage fees. Port authorities lose docking, storage, and handling income. Ancillary industries, inspection services, fuel suppliers, maintenance contractors feel the impact as volumes shift. Individually, these losses may seem manageable. Collectively, over a decade, they compound into billions. This is why the move landed in Washington not as a technical infrastructure story, but as a strategic surprise. The assumption had long been that Canada would remain structurally tied to U.S. logistics, regardless of political disagreements. The Hudson Bay Corridor was treated as a historical footnote, not a future threat. That assumption no longer holds. From the perspective of U.S. logistics giants, the concern is not simply lost volume, it is precedent. North American trade networks are built on predictability. Once a reliable alternative proves viable, shippers begin to ask uncomfortable questions. Why accept congestion in U.S. ports when a shorter Atlantic route exists? Why tolerate exposure to labor strikes or regulatory delays when another corridor offers contractual certainty? Even if only a fraction of Canadian exports reroute north, the psychological impact on market behavior is significant. American ports along the Gulf Coast and the Pacific Northwest are particularly exposed. These facilities invested heavily in infrastructure optimized for Canadian throughput. Vancouver may remain dominant for Pacific trade, but for Europe-bound cargo, Churchill's geographic logic is difficult to ignore. The distance is shorter, the number of intermediaries is fewer, and with expanded icebreaker support and port upgrades, the seasonal limitation, once the corridor's Achilles heel, has narrowed. There is also a geopolitical layer that amplifies the unease. U.S. logistics power has long functioned as a form of soft influence. Control over infrastructure translates into influence over timelines, costs, and priorities. During periods of political friction, that influence becomes visible. Canada's decision to deliberately route around American systems reduces Washington's ability to apply subtle pressure in future trade or diplomatic disputes. That loss of leverage, while rarely acknowledged publicly, is deeply felt in strategic circles. At the same time, the disruption is not universally negative for the United States. Some analysts argue that forcing diversification may ultimately strengthen North American resilience. Reduced congestion in U.S. ports could improve efficiency for domestic exporters. Competition may drive innovation and cost discipline among rail operators. And the reality is that Canada's move does not sever trade ties. It recalibrates them. American companies will still participate in North American supply chains, just not as uncontested gatekeepers. Yet adjustment is rarely painless. Regions that built their economic models around Canadian transit volumes now face uncertainty. Labor unions worry about job security. Port authorities question long-term investment assumptions. Rail operators reassess asset utilization. These pressures arrive at a moment when global trade is already strained by geopolitical fragmentation, reshoring trends, and technological disruption. Politically, the optics are equally uncomfortable. The narrative of seamless North American integration clashes with the image of an ally actively designing routes to bypass U.S. infrastructure. It raises questions about trust, reciprocity, and the long-term direction of bilateral economic relations. While public rhetoric may remain diplomatic, internal recalculations are unavoidable. What makes this moment especially consequential is that it is not driven by hostility, but by self-interest. Canada is not punishing the United States, it is insulating itself. And that distinction matters. Infrastructure decisions once made outlast political cycles. Steel and concrete do not reverse course after elections. By the time the full impact is visible, the strategic shift will already be locked in. The Hudson Bay Railway's revival thus forces American logistics power to confront a reality it long postponed. Dependence cuts both ways. When partners gain options, leverage erodes. And in a world where supply chains are increasingly weaponized, losing control over routes, even friendly ones, carries strategic consequences that extend far beyond the docks. Winners inside Canada, industries, regions, and sovereignty. While the shockwaves ripple south, the most immediate effects of the Hudson Bay Railway revival are being felt inside Canada itself. For decades, Canadian producers adapted to dependence because they had little choice. Now, entire sectors are recalculating their futures around something they have not had in generations: leverage. Agriculture sits at the center of this shift. The prairie provinces produce some of the largest volumes of wheat, canola, and specialty crops in the world. Historically, these commodities moved west to Vancouver or south into U.S. networks before crossing the Atlantic. For European buyers, that path was longer, more expensive, and exposed to congestion at foreign ports. Churchill changes the math. With a Class 1 railway capable of handling unit trains, grain can move directly north to Tidewater, cutting distance and reducing handling layers. For farmers operating on thin margins, even small cost reductions compound into meaningful gains over time. Beyond cost, there is predictability. Agricultural contracts are unforgiving. Missed delivery windows translate into penalties and lost relationships. A reliable northern corridor reduces exposure to labor disputes, policy shifts, or bottlenecks beyond Canadian control. That reliability strengthens Canada's reputation as a dependable supplier at a moment when global food security is under strain from climate disruption and geopolitical conflict. Potash follows closely behind. Saskatchewan dominates global production, and roughly 95% of output is exported. Historically, much of that tonnage flowed through American railways and ports, especially for European destinations. Heavy loads limited routing options, effectively locking producers into U.S. systems. The Class 1 upgrade removes that constraint. Agreements already signed by fertilizer producers signal that Churchill is no longer theoretical. It is operational. Each redirected shipment represents revenue retained within Canadian-controlled infrastructure and bargaining power reclaimed by exporters. Critical minerals add a layer of strategic significance that extends beyond economics. Nickel, cobalt, lithium, and rare earth elements are essential to modern manufacturing, defense systems, and energy transitions. Canada holds significant deposits, particularly in northern regions where infrastructure has long been a bottleneck. Direct rail access to an Arctic port reduces costs and accelerates timelines for bringing these resources to market. For European partners seeking to diversify away from politically risky suppliers, a Canada to Europe corridor that bypasses U.S. intermediaries is not just attractive, it is strategic. Energy infrastructure further expands the list of potential beneficiaries. Proposals under the Port of Churchill Plus concept envision corridors for liquefied natural gas, hydrogen transported as ammonia, and expanded electricity transmission. Alberta's interest in an energy route to Churchill reflects a broader ambition: access to global markets without reliance on U.S. export terminals. While many of these projects remain proposals, the existence of high-capacity rail fundamentally changes what is feasible. Northern and Indigenous communities stand to gain in ways that go beyond freight volumes. The Arctic Gateway Group's ownership of the railway and port is not symbolic. It places long-neglected infrastructure under local control. Jobs tied to maintenance, operations, monitoring, and port expansion provide stable employment in regions historically excluded from national growth strategies. More importantly, ownership means agency. Decisions about development, environmental management, and long-term planning are no longer imposed from afar. At a national level, the revival of the Hudson Bay Railway reinforces a principle that had eroded quietly over time. Sovereignty is not abstract. It is built into systems. Trade sovereignty does not come from treaties alone. It comes from physical routes that cannot be easily pressured, delayed, or shut down by external actors. By investing in redundancy and independence, Canada reduces vulnerability not just to U.S. politics, but to global shocks of any kind. Yet even among winners, challenges remain. The Arctic environment is unforgiving, and climate change introduces new uncertainties. Thawing permafrost can destabilize even modern engineering. Extended shipping seasons depend on icebreaker support and continued investment. And while reliability has improved dramatically, trust from global shippers must be earned over time, not declared. Still, the broader trajectory is clear. Industries that once accepted dependence as the price of doing business now have alternatives. Regions long dismissed as peripheral are becoming central nodes in a reimagined trade network. And Canada, by choosing to invest where it once retreated, signals a shift from passive integration to active strategy. The question now is not whether the Hudson Bay Corridor matters, but how far its influence will extend, and who will struggle to adapt as the balance shifts. Part 4. The costs, risks, and unintended consequences. For all its promise, the revival of the Hudson Bay Railway is not without risk. Strategic independence carries a price. An infrastructure built at the edge of the Arctic will always test the limits of engineering, finance, and political patience. The same factors that doomed the railway in the past have not vanished. They have been mitigated, not eliminated. Permafrost remains unstable by nature. Climate change adds volatility, increasing freeze-thaw cycles that stress even modern roadbeds. While advanced monitoring and predictive maintenance dramatically reduce surprise failures, they also lock the railway into a permanent, high-cost maintenance regime. This is not a corridor that can be built once and forgotten. It demands constant investment, technical expertise, and long-term commitment from governments that may not always share the same priorities. Financial exposure is another concern. The $262 million reconstruction is only the opening chapter. Port expansion, icebreaker support, storage facilities, and future energy corridors all require additional capital. If projected volumes fail to materialize at scale, the burden of sustaining the system may fall disproportionately on public budgets. Critics argue that while strategic value is real, the economic case depends heavily on optimistic assumptions about global demand, European access, and uninterrupted operations. There is also the risk of over-politicization. By framing the railway as a tool of sovereignty and resistance to U.S. pressure, Ottawa raises expectations that extend beyond freight metrics. Infrastructure, once cast as a geopolitical statement, becomes vulnerable to symbolic scrutiny. Any disruption, weather-related, technical, or financial, risks being interpreted not as operational reality, but as strategic failure. That perception can undermine confidence faster than actual performance issues. Environmental concerns add another layer of complexity. Increased traffic through fragile northern ecosystems raises legitimate questions about spill response, wildlife disruption, and cumulative impacts on coastal waters. While proponents argue that shorter routes reduce overall emissions, local effects are harder to dismiss. Indigenous ownership strengthens environmental stewardship, but it does not eliminate trade-offs between economic opportunity and ecological preservation. Internationally, diversification may also introduce friction. European partners welcome new supply routes, but they too factor reliability above all else. Seasonal limits, even when extended, still differentiate Churchill from ice-free ports further south. Competing Arctic routes, particularly from Russia, underscore that the Arctic is becoming a contested space where infrastructure choices carry strategic implications far beyond commerce. Perhaps the most subtle consequence is internal. By investing heavily in one corridor, Canada risks creating new dependencies if diversification is not balanced. Vancouver, Prince Rupert, and eastern ports remain essential. Resilience comes from redundancy, not replacement. The challenge lies in integrating the Hudson Bay route into a broader, flexible network rather than elevating it as a singular solution. None of these risks negate the strategic logic of the investment, but they temper the narrative of transformation with realism. Independence is not free, sovereignty is not maintenance light, and infrastructure that reshapes power relationships must endure not just political enthusiasm, but decades of operational stress. The success of the Hudson Bay Railway will ultimately be measured not by announcements or symbolism, but by whether it performs quietly, reliably, and profitably long after the headlines fade. The path forward, Canada's Arctic Rail revival, is not a rejection of partnership, but a recalibration of power. By reclaiming control over how its resources reach the world, Canada reduces vulnerability while forcing long-standing systems to adapt. The Hudson Bay Railway will not erase risk, nor will it instantly transform trade, but it has already changed the conversation. The future now depends on execution, on reliability, environmental responsibility, and sustained investment beyond political cycles. As global trade fractures into strategic corridors, the question is no longer whether Canada needed an alternative, but whether others are prepared for the consequences of one finally working.